the barometer results for this year's stock take. My name's Denise Horn from Adoption UK Scotland. 7 years into our annual publication, we're still seeing similar issues being shared in the results. But today I'm pleased to introduce Becky Brooks, who is the report author, to share more about the narrative behind the statistics and give us all a whistle-stop tour of the Scottish report and the results. So I'm just going to pass over to Becky.
Thanks, Denise. Thanks for inviting me to come and do this, and thank you to you all for giving up your time at lunchtime to come and listen to what I have to say about the barometer this year. As Denise said, this is the 7th annual Adoption Barometer survey. We do this every year across the UK. Any adopter or adoptee can come and fill it in. It's not only for members of Adoption UK, it's really open to everybody, and we publicise it widely through adoption agencies and on social media and lots of different places, and we do get quite a broad variety of people filling the survey in. This year in total across the UK we had around 3,800 respondents, but I'm here to talk to you today really just about those people who are living in Scotland who responded to the survey, and to talk about the statistical data and some of the stories behind that that appear in Scotland's version of the Adoption Barometer report. So for the past 2 years, I think, we've done a separate barometer report for each nation, just to give each nation the ability to really dive down into the specific issues of what's going on in those specific nations, rather than a UK-wide overview, which, as we know, can often be very similar to essentially what is happening in England, because the population is so great there that it really skews the results. So it's really great to be able to present these results that are based almost entirely on statistical data, only from those living in Scotland when they completed the survey. We put out our survey in January and February of 2025, and we asked people, for the most part, to only answer the questions thinking about what was going on during 2024. So most of the questions relate to, did this happen in 2024, or did that happen in 2024? And we focus on a target year like that each year, so that we can build up comparative data from one year to the next to see how things are changing or not changing. And so that's the tack I'm going to take with this presentation today. We're going to look for things, we're looking for things that to celebrate, we're looking for things that are either doing really well or that we can see signs of really positive change. And then we're going to be looking at some stories that are still challenging us, things where we're perhaps not doing as well as we'd like, or we're perhaps not making the progress that we'd like. Across Scotland this year we had 60 respondents who were in what we call early stages. So that is people who are undergoing approvals or matching during 2024. Those who have had a child move into their family either on early permanence placement or adoptive placement during 2024, and or have obtained an adoption order during 2024. So it's anyone going through that process. We had 208 what we call established family respondents. So those are respondents who have an adopted child age from 0 to 25, whose adoption was finalised before the target year, so before 2024. So it's basically all adoptive families, not including prospective adopters. And of those 208, 75 were respondents who had at least one child aged 13 to 25. We do have some specific questions about issues that are particularly relevant to those teenage and adolescent years. We also have questions for adoptees. This year we lowered the age range. Our questions for adoptees have previously always been for adoptees aged 18 plus, but this year, in consultation with adoptee youth groups around the UK, we came up with a set of questions for adoptees aged 16 to 25 to try to delve more into those issues of transitioning to adulthood, education, really the things that they felt were important and they wanted to tell us about from their point of view and to get their perspective. So in total across Scotland, we have 36 adoptees completed the survey. It is quite a small sample size, so we need to bear that in mind when we're looking at the results. And that includes a small number that were in the 60 to 25 age range. And because it is such a small number, when we look at the data from the 60 to 25 age range, I am going to be talking about UK-wide data just to give that a better sense of statistical validity, really, because it was quite a small number if we just look at Scotland alone. So we'll start with our things that we're celebrating or things that we're highlighting. And we'll start at the very beginning of the process, because what we find this year, as in previous years, is that perceptions of the approvals process to become an adoptive parent remain strongly positive. 88% were satisfied with the training. This is just in Scotland. 84% were satisfied with social worker support. What I will mention as well is that we do ask people where they are, and we did get respondents from every local authority area in Scotland, except, if I remember rightly, Western Isles and I think Orkney, but everywhere else had at least somebody from that local authority area responding. Obviously, there were some local authority areas that are more populous and had more respondents, but we picked up quite a good spread across the nation. Wonderfully, more than 9 in 10 agreed that when it came to matching, they felt that everything possible had been done to find the right match for them and their child, and that was the highest percentage saying that of any UK nation, which is really encouraging. And similarly, 83% of new adopters in Scotland were satisfied with the quality of their life journey materials. And again, that was the highest satisfaction rate across the UK. So that really is something to celebrate. Life story materials are really important to early stage adopters. And when we get results from people who are not satisfied with the quality or who haven't received the materials in a timely fashion, adopters really do have a lot to say about that in terms of how important they feel it is to have that material in place from the very beginning, to be able to have those essential conversations from the start. And so it's really encouraging to see such a high proportion saying that they're satisfied with the quality of those materials. Moving on to adoption support. Now, adoption support is always a thorny issue. It's a huge priority for adoptive parents. But what we found this year was that more than 3/4 of respondents in Scotland said that the core adoption support they had accessed had had a positive impact on their family. Now, by core adoption support, what we mean is, and we do explain this in the survey so people know what they're asking questions about, answering the questions about. What we mean by core adoption support is those services that are offered by adoption agencies that might be useful for any family at any time. So they're not targeted to a specific need that a family is requesting help for. They're offered generally to all adoptive families. So that might include sort of general training courses about life story work or that kind of thing. It might include peer support groups or community activities that are being put on. It can include information and advice that's on the website, or that you might get from just ringing a social worker with a quick question and they can give you some advice over the phone. So it's those general core offers that are not particularly tailored to an individual family, but that might be available to access. And as I've said, more than 3/4 are saying that's had a positive impact. Now, we think this is really important. Last year, for the Adoption Barometer report, we did a lot of work analysing and looking at people's journey through adoption support. And what we found was that those families, those respondents who accessed core adoption support and said it had a positive impact, were actually more likely than other respondents to access what we call enhanced adoption support. So that is reaching out for help for a specific issue that they're looking for some specific input about. So they were more likely to reach out for help with specific issues, but they were more likely to do that earlier, before their family reached what severe challenge or crisis point. So for every respondent that says they accessed enhanced adoption support in the year, we ask them to describe their status at the point of doing that. And what we find is that those last year who had accessed good quality core support were less likely to be at crisis point or experiencing severe challenges when they asked for help with specific issues. And what we also can find from the data is that those who are not experiencing severe challenges when they ask for help are more likely to have better outcomes. So that's kind of a bit of a complicated story. But what we can see developing there is a really good thread between accessing good quality core adoption support from your agency, which we think encourages families to seek help earlier before they reach crisis point, which in turn leads to them having better outcomes from the help that they've sought, which is surely to everyone's benefit. So it really is a story to celebrate that 3/4 of respondents who access this core support said it had a positive impact, because we think that can have all kind of positive knock-on effects if families experience difficulties, that they already have that relationship with their agency, they've already had that good experience, they're perhaps willing to go and ask for help earlier, get measures put in place quickly, and as a result potentially have a more positive outcome from seeking the help that they've sought. So that's definitely one to celebrate. We also found in Scotland this year that more families with the highest support needs were being offered targeted and enhanced adoption support. So I'll just explain this again a little bit. As I said, when we asked families if they sought adoption support during a given year, we asked them to describe what their status was at the time of asking for support. And there are 4 options. They can either be anticipating possible future needs and looking for a bit of advice. They can be experiencing specific challenges in need of help. They can be experiencing severe challenges and in need of urgent help, or the 4th option is that they can be at crisis point. And what we then do with this data is we pull out those that said they were experiencing severe challenges or at crisis point, and we look in detail at the adoption support packages that they'd been offered. So they've got a huge range of things to choose from, of the types of support that they might have been offered, including everything from signposting to another service, to advice over the phone, to peer support group, right through to therapeutic life story work or other therapeutic interventions. And then what we do is we look at this group and we say, what proportion of this high needs group, those with the most complex and challenging needs, what proportion were offered very tailored and specific enhanced support, as opposed to being offered core support or signposting to other services. Now, we would never expect 100% of families in this situation to be offered and this enhanced support, because in some cases, depending on what the phone call was about, signposting to another service may actually be appropriate. So that we understand that there are a range of things that might be offered. But what we found in 2024 was, of this high needs group, 44% were offered targeted enhanced adoption support. Now, what I'm going to say about this is that is lower than in other nations, but it is higher than previously in Scotland. And so we're taking that as a story to celebrate that more families with the highest needs have been able to access specific, tailored, enhanced adoption support programs that have been really tailored to the family's needs. And as I said, those could include any kind of therapeutic intervention. It might include respite or short breaks. It might include financial support, for example. There's a whole range of things there, but it's encouraging to see that proportion increasing. And I think as well, we're going to talk about education a little bit more later, but a small good news story in education is that the highest proportion ever of respondents from Scotland said that their child's teachers at school have a good understanding of the needs of adopted learners. Now, it is only 52%, and we'd like it to be 100% that, obviously, but it's encouraging to see that increasing. And one of the reasons it's encouraging to see that increasing from the point of view of practitioners and adoption support, and we'll talk about this later, is that when we asked people who had contacted adoption support during 24 with a specific request for help, the most common reason, and I was actually surprised about this, we've not asked this question before in this way, but the most common reason for them contacting adoption support was issues around education. And so the more that we can see that schools are able to meet the needs of adopted learners, hopefully the fewer people will be ringing adoption support with issues around education, and taking, really, which is really putting a burden on stretched adoption support services over a situation that they may not really have the capacity or even the expertise in some cases to deal with. So yeah, it's always good to see more people reporting that schools are able to understand and meet the needs of adopted learners. And that's, like I said, that was the highest ever in Scotland. That was great. Oh, and one final one. So I'm just going to show you 2 graphs here, but this is about adult adoptees, and this is about adult adoptees accessing records. And what I wanted to show you this because it's an example of the small changes we sometimes see that give us a glimmer that maybe things are beginning to improve in some services. So bear in mind that we had 36 adult adoptees responding to the survey this year. So this is not from a vast evidence base, and I must make that very clear. But we asked people to tell us how easy it was to find out how to go about accessing their personal records as an adult adoptee, and overall how well supported they felt by the professionals they contacted while seeking their personal records. And I was able to split the data down to compare the results of those who attempted to access records within the past 5 years as compared to those who accessed more than 5 years ago. And that's important because when we're asking questions to adult adoptees, we are usually asking them about any time in their lifetime. Have you ever tried to access your records? Have you ever undergone a process of tracing and reunion? And part of the reason for that is because we don't want to prohibit adult adoptees from being able to tell their stories by limiting it to 1 year. And part of the reason for that is because many of the processes that adult adoptees go through, like tracing, like accessing records, take well more than a year to complete. And so to limit it into 1 year really would limit the amount of responses and stories that we're able to get. So what we do instead is we ask them if they've ever done that, and then we ask them, was it in the last 5 years? Was it more than 5 years ago? And this is what we saw when we separated out the results. Now, what we're looking for really here is for the pink and the yellow bars to be the biggest. That's what we'd really like, because that would be people who completely or somewhat agree with these statements, that it was easy to find out what to do and that they felt well supported. And we're not quite there yet. But I think what you can see is on the top bars, which is within the past 5 years, on both of them, there's a bit less purple and green and a little bit more red and yellow. And that's encouraging, because it's not I wouldn't like to say definitively that means there's been an improvement, but it indicates that it's possible that people who are accessing the records now more recently are perhaps having a slightly better experience than people who accessed their records longer ago. And this is something we're going to be keeping our eyes on over the next few adoption barometers. We know that there is work afoot actually across the UK to try and improve these services for adult adoptees. And it's always absolutely fantastic if we can see anything coming through the adoption barometer that suggests that changes to policy and practice are actually having a really positive impact on people's experiences. So those are our stories to celebrate. I'm going to move us on now to the things that are perhaps a little bit challenging. And what I want to do first is to try and place what's coming next into a slightly broader context. When I wrote the adoption barometer last year, what was very, very noticeable was that last year was record breaking in terms of the level of challenges that families were experiencing. And those are not just challenges related to adoption or being an adoptive family or being an adoptive parent. They were including broader challenges related to everything that's going on in the world at the moment and some of the things that are making life difficult for people. We know that we're still really in a post-COVID landscape in some ways. Shortly after COVID, there was what was called the cost of living crisis. There are economic challenges. There are stretched services. So everywhere, I think there is a broader context to the challenges that families are reporting, and I want to set out that context now before we move on to talk about some of the things that they say they're finding difficult. Now, this graph is possibly showing too many things. But this is just showing two metrics across all the years of the barometer. It feels like a continual struggle to get the help and support my child needs, is the sort of blue-purple line, and that's the proportion that somewhat or completely agreed with that. But also I feel optimistic about my family's future on the green line, and that's the proportion that somewhat or completely agreed with that. Now, last year, 2024, I'm going to say I thought those were anomalous figures at the time, and I still think they're anomalous figures. They sort of stand out there. But if you look at the trend from 2019 to 2025, you can see that the green line is on a trend of going down. People are feeling less optimistic. And the purple line's on a trend of going up. People are more inclined to say they feel like they're struggling to get the help and support their child needs. And as I've said, this goes beyond purely adoption support. And we'll talk about some of the other services and the challenges that families are experiencing. So in the UK as a whole, we again saw record highs of families facing severe challenges and that. In Scotland, it was a slight improvement on last year, but I feel as though, like I said, last year was a little bit anomalous. But on a trend, we're seeing that families are facing significant challenges. So among those challenges, we'll need to include adoption support. There's always a lot written about adoption support in the barometer, and I would encourage you to go and take a look at the whole report, which is available on our website. And if you just Google it, actually, adoption barometer, it's there. I think what I wanted to draw out of the report this year was concerns about the range of support that is available. So what we find is that nearly 3/4 of parents who responded said that when they'd contacted their agency for adoption support, they thought that the person who dealt with their request was knowledgeable, understanding, which is which is pretty good. I mean, obviously we'd like that to be 100%, but 72%. The concern that people are expressing most often is not necessarily that when they contact adoption support, nobody can help them or nobody understands. The concern is often to do with the range of support that's available. And I think this quote encapsulates the kinds of comments that people make about that. This person wrote, "I find the support really sporadic. We're offered random, slightly appropriate things because they're available, but it means it doesn't feel like we have a good plan." And I think what comes across in comments, and respondents have a lot of opportunity to put free comments in the survey, and I do read them all, and there are thousands of them. But one of the things that comes across in Scotland in particular is like quite a variation between one local authority and another in terms of what's available. And so I do get quite a lot of comments of people saying things like, well, my friend that lives in X place has been offered this, but I asked for this in our local authority and it's not available for us. I think you know, with in a social media age, adoptive families are all gathering together on Facebook groups and all kinds of different ways, and people do get to hear what's going on in other places, and I think it can become quite a bugbear for people, that they feel as though other people are being offered things that they're not being offered. Having said that, we also appreciate, and parents do acknowledge this in the comments, that in some areas, and especially in rural areas, it can be difficult to have the range of provision available to everybody in the area in a reasonable sort of distance away, or to really be able to access the full range of things. But I did want to draw this out of this year's, because it isn't really that adoptive parents are saying that their adoption support agencies are not trying to help them. It's more to do with the types of things that are on offer, and whether people are being offered how can I put this? Whether people are being offered on the basis of what's available, and there are sometimes challenges with making sure that all kinds of different things are available. So that was worth mentioning this year. And I'm saying that in the context of what we looked at earlier about the satisfaction with core adoption support and the increase in numbers of families who say that they're being offered these tailored and specific enhanced adoption supports. So I don't want to be all doom and gloom, but this issue with range has been going on for a while now. It's quite a regular feature, and I think it's worth thinking about. The second area, which is always an area of concern really, and it has been in every adoption barometer in every nation since its inception, is around support for maintaining birth family links, or what we might call contact. We ask in most years we ask families whether their indirect or their letterbox indirect contact arrangements are being maintained. We've asked this in a few different ways really, but this year we simply said, do you have any agreements for indirect contact? Which family members is this with? And have these agreements had a reciprocal change of letters in the last 18 months? So when it's written there that it says indirect contact arrangements are not fully active, what that means is the respondent has said there has not been a reciprocal exchange of letters in the last 18 months. So it may be that one side has written a letter but hasn't received a reply, but it hasn't been reciprocal. And what we find was, with all birth relatives, more than half of the contact arrangements were not reciprocal in the past 18 months. And when we break that down by age of child, we can see that, as expected among older children, the rate of lapse is quite high. But actually, even among younger children too, some contact arrangements are already lapsed. And when we ask about the reasons for that, it is as we'd expect. And as we found it before in previous barometers, quite frequently because replies have not been received. Sometimes adoptive parents have just not been able to, have just said that life has overtaken them and they've not been able to get round to it that year. But most commonly it is to do with receiving replies, and that over time it lapses. Sometimes adopted children themselves will have requested the parents stop writing the letters. There's a whole range of reasons, but I think it is always worth saying the challenges around maintaining indirect contact in a way that is reciprocal, because I think we can probably all agree that writing letters every year but never getting one back isn't really maintaining contact from the point of view of the adopted child or young person. If it's not reciprocal, then it's not really maintaining the birth family links. We're seeing across the UK a trend for increasing amounts of direct contact. This is a little lower in Scotland and in fact in Wales than elsewhere. It's highest in Northern Ireland, but Northern Ireland's quite unusual in the way that it manages that. But it is rising in Scotland. 28% of children represented by respondents had direct contact with a birth relative in 2024. Those were most often informal arrangements with birth siblings. So these are arrangements between maybe where birth siblings have been adopted into another family or in foster care or especially on a kinship order somewhere, and they've arranged informally to get together and meet up regularly. That's the most common, but there are small numbers of children who are having direct contact with birth parents and wider relatives such as grandparents, aunties and uncles. What we've seen in Scotland, as in common with everywhere else in the UK, is that as the amount of direct contact is rising, and I'm not saying this is a causal link, I'm just saying it happens to be happening at the same time, the satisfaction with the support that adoptive families are receiving to maintain contact is falling, and that's happening everywhere. So I'm flagging this up at every meeting I go to because I think it's fair to say that across the UK there's been an ongoing conversation about maintaining contact after the adoption order. There are certainly a lot of conversations about how whether that should be promoted more, whether there should be more direct contact, and what that would look like for a child, how we can make it safe and meaningful contact. And I think what the barometer shows us is that when we ask parents if they're open to contact, really quite a lot of adoptive parents are open to having direct contact, but they're not confident that they're going to get the support that they need. Either their child, them, or the birth relative involved there's going to be enough resources to make sure that everybody has the support they need to make that contact not only enduring, but also meaningful and safe for everybody involved. And so this is something that is a challenge really for all of us. To think about how support for contact could be resourced, so that contact, so that if we're looking to see increasing levels of contact, that it's actually done in a way that is really beneficial for everybody. When we think about adult adoptees and the position of maintaining birth family links, so it's fair to say that the majority, just over half of the adult adoptees that completed the survey have been adopted before 1975. And so we're mainly talking about adult adoptees who would have had little to no opportunity to have any kind of maintaining contact of any sort with birth relatives during childhood. So for most people, it is a question of, we're really talking about tracing and reunion here rather than maintaining any birth family link. But in Scotland, just 41% said they would feel confident approaching professional services for help with tracing birth relatives. And what we found in the data was that actually the majority of those who said that they had traced birth relatives had done it by themselves. So they'd gone social media, they'd done DNA testing, they'd gone to all different places to try and get information and trace people themselves without any professional help. And I think it's fair to say from the comments and the stories that people told us in the barometer that for some it had gone well. They'd managed to trace birth relatives, it had been okay, and for others it had been extremely difficult and a disaster. And in fact, more than one person did say, they wished they'd known what support was available, or they wished they'd asked for support. So I think the low levels of confidence in the professional services available to support with tracing and reunion, and coupled with a definite sense that the financial costs involved are going to be extremely burdensome and actually a barrier to doing that, is something that is worth looking at. Because I think if adult adoptees don't feel confident that they're going to get the support they need, then there's perhaps more chance that they go on their own, and for some of them that has resulted in difficult situations arising. As I've said, there were others who had gone it alone and reported that things had gone really well. So it's not a judgment on what people are choosing to do in terms of tracing and reunion. It's mainly about making sure that everyone is aware of what support is available, and that support does actually meet the needs of adult adoptees who are wanting to trace. Moving on. So far we've mainly spoken about adoption support things. But I think it's fair to say, as I've tried to mention earlier on when I spoke about the challenges that families are facing, I think it's fair to say that not all of the problems that families and adoptees are experiencing are rooted in adoption services, and not all of the solutions to the problems families are experiencing will be can be provided by adoption support services. We've looked at a few things that are relevant around contact, around tracing and reunion, around adoption support, and those kinds of things. But as I said earlier, the other services that families are trying to interact with, and many adoptive families will interact with many services, will also have a knock-on effect on adoption support services. So in education, the top statistic there, and this is what I was saying earlier, 59% of parents who contacted adoption support for specific help during 2024 said that issues related to education was the reason for seeking help, and it was the most common reason. The next most common reason was issues related to violence and aggression in the home, and it was a few percentage points behind. We found this year that a quarter of children represented by respondents were reported to be attending school on a part-time basis. We found that 16% of children represented by respondents had been what we informally excluded during 2024. So an informal exclusion is when a child is asked to go home or asked not to come into school for reasons other than illness or school closure, without this being recorded as a suspension or a temporary exclusion. We know that, and I try to follow this because I'm very interested in it from a professional point of view. In Scotland, have taken great strides around adverse childhood experiences awareness, around really trying to raise the awareness about that in schools. And we know that there's been a lot of work in Scotland to reduce exclusions, and we've seen that. But I think there is perhaps amongst some of our children an underlying issue going on where our adopted children are not necessarily being excluded from school, and which is great, but they're kind of hidden. They're having hidden barriers to attending school by being on part-time timetables, and some parents reported their children been on part-time timetables for years at school. Now, part-time timetables can be a really useful temporary measure to overcome a specific challenge, or help children to get to a point where they're able to attend school. But when it goes on for years, it's not helpful. It becomes evident that the school is not able to meet the educational needs of the child, and the child's really being denied an education. And also, the second one of these is the potentially the hidden factor of children parents being called in to collect their children for school for all kinds of reasons that are not related to illness, but those are not being recorded as suspensions. Now, we understand why schools do this. We understand it can be a kindness. We don't want to actually suspend your child from school, but there is a problem and something needs to be done. But again, if that's happening repeatedly, or it's going on for a long time, then that's a child's educational needs not being met in school. Scottish respondents were less likely than elsewhere in the UK to be aware that their child's school had received relevant training on the impact of care experience and adoption on children in education. I'll say that it was pretty low. It's pretty low everywhere, but it just happens to be at lowest in Scotland. And when we asked 16 to 25-year-old adoptees about education, I mean, frankly, I could have put any one of a number of statistics because they were excoriated, unfortunately, about their experiences of being in school, really quite uncompromising in what they had to say about it. But this is an example. 45% of them said they'd never encountered an adult at school who they felt understood about adoption and its impacts. I will say that when we asked children to sort of quantify their experience at school, only 7% of them said that they felt that secondary school was positive most of the time. 60-odd% of them said that it was negative most of the time. 66% of them said that they were bullied or teased at secondary school on account of issues relating to being adopted. They had a lot to say about that, actually. So education continues to challenge us. Health and mental health. So again, we're looking at services outside of adoption support, but there will impact on adoption support services because of the way that families are sometimes pushed from one service to another when trying to seek help. So we know, of course, from national data and from all kinds of, and from obviously adoption barometers in the past, that adopted children are more likely to have social, emotional and mental health needs than the general population. We found in Scotland in 2024, 50% of the children represented by respondents had missed school because of mental health concerns. We asked 16 to 25-year-olds about their experiences of accessing CAMHS. They weren't very positive about that. And again, that is UK-wide, that data is UK-wide. But 71% of them said they didn't think that the support they received from CAMHS had made a positive difference to them. And the same proportion said they didn't feel as though the professionals they worked with at CAMHS really understood how being adopted might have affected them. And I think this is important to think about this context here for adoptive families and adoptees. Families and adoptees will access lots and lots of different services, who will be more or less adoption informed, usually less adoption informed. But when families are seeking services from somebody who understands what adoption is about, they will always end up circling back round to adoption support. And so there's quite a lot in the barometer this year about really talking about how important it is to ensure that other services that families are interacting with have some level of training or understanding of adoption, adverse childhood experiences and the impact of that on people, so that when an adopted young person goes to CAMHS, for the same kinds of reasons that any other child might go to CAMHS, they get the same level of service as any other child. They don't find themselves being signposted off somewhere else or not being able to be properly dealt with because the adoption factor is not being taken into account. Just moving on, still on health and mental health, and we're looking now at adult adoptees. So this is a story we've been trying to tell for quite some time at Adoption UK around the challenges that adult adoptees find, similarly to the adopted young people. We've just seen that statistic in accessing mental health support that is what we're going to call adoptee competent. Now, this is a phrase that's come about through consultation with members of Adoption UK's Adult Adoptee Advisory Group. We really wanted to try to encapsulate what it was about therapeutic support that made it more or less suitable for an adoptee to access. And the phrase was adoptee competent, and the simple definition of that was that the professional delivering the service had significant training and expertise on the impact of adoption on the adoptee and or lived experience as an adoptee. So that a lot of people find that preferable, but it wasn't 100% necessary. But the adoptee competence was to do with having significant training and expertise about the impact of adoption on the adoptee. And we included that definition in the survey when we asked questions about this. So when we were asking people about whether they'd been able to access adoptee competent mental health support, they did have that definition written down to work on. 85% of adult adoptees who responded in Scotland said they didn't know where they could access that. And to be honest, that's very similar across the UK. There's nothing different there from any other nation. We worked with a clinical psychologist who is an adoptee this year to craft some questions about the effectiveness of the mental health support that adult adoptees have been able to access. And what we did was we came up with a range of questions about outcomes of accessing support that are very similar to those used, standardised questions that are used by therapists and counsellors in order to evaluate how a client has experienced the service they've received. And what we did was we asked adult adoptees if they'd access any therapy, counselling or mental health support ever. And we asked them to think about their most recent time of accessing that and to say whether they considered the professional they work with to have been adoptee competent or not adoptee competent. And then we asked them these outcome questions, and they were questions like, my overall well-being is improved as a result of accessing this therapy, or so that kind of thing. And what we found was on every single metric, and there were 10 metrics, on every single measurement, those who said that they thought their professional had been adoptee competent were much more significantly likely to report positive outcomes on every metric from accessing the support than those who did not feel as though their professional had been adoptee competent. Now, all respondents on average reported some positive outcomes, but those who said their professional was adoptee competent was much more likely to say to give really positive outcomes. And I think the thing that challenges us about that is to say that UK-wide, because that work was all done UK-wide to get the maximum number of people for the best impact on the data. But UK-wide, of the adult adoptees who had sought mental health support, only 29% actually said that their professional that they accessed was adoptee competent. And that's challenging for us. That is challenging for everyone delivering services to adoptees, because the data in our small survey clearly showed that outcomes were much better when people had that adoptee competent mental health support than when they didn't have that. And then finally, on this one, we asked a lot of questions, again supported by our Adult Adoptee Advisory Group, about the implications of not having access to your own family medical history. And what we found was that in Scotland, that's the Scotland data, 34% of adult adoptees in Scotland said that they'd experienced a delay in medical diagnosis or treatment because of lack of information about their family medical history. And this plays out in a number of ways. Excuse me. It can be that, so first of all, adoptees report that they're asked for their family medical history all the time. And in fact, I'm an adoptive parent, and I took my child to the doctor the other day for a review of a chronic but minor condition, and they asked about family medical history in that review, and we don't know it. We can't give them any information about it. And so for adult adoptees, many times they're going to a medical appointment where they're being asked this information, people are writing in the comments that they find this, embarrassing, frustrating, that continue having to keep saying, no, I don't know I'm adopted, I don't know I'm adopted. So that's the first, perhaps the entry level problem that people face. More serious is, if you are unable to say that you have a family history of, say, glaucoma, then you won't be entitled to screening for glaucoma. If you're unable to say that you have a family history of any number of conditions where, if you did have a family history, you would be invited for screening, or you would, there would be testing available for you. You don't get invited for that screening. And what happens is, what adoptees report is that they'll be asked if they've got a family history of something. They will say they don't know because they're adopted, and that will be put down as no family history. Whereas actually the real response is don't know, there could still be a risk. And we had, with these questions this year, many respondents telling really quite heartbreaking stories, to be honest, about living with ill health, undiagnosed conditions for years and years, only to find out after many years of medical mystery that they had something that actually is inheritable. That if they'd known that was in the family, they would have been able to be tested for it much earlier and found out. And there was one respondent, for example, from Scotland, I think from Scotland, explained how this person had traced their birth mum, and had asked about family medical history, and discovered that birth mum had breast cancer. And so they'd gone back to their GP and said, I found out that my birth mum has had breast cancer, can I get the screening for that? And the GP had said no, because you have to have more than one relative. You need more than one relative. So she didn't have the screening for it. But several years later was able to reconnect with another member of the birth family, and only at that point found out that actually 3 or 4 members of the family had breast cancer, and she would have been entitled to that screening all along. So this is a serious issue for adult adoptees. There's quite a lot about it in the barometer, and it's something that Adoption UK is going to be talking about more in the future. And I would really encourage you to go and look as well, because there are other stories. I've not got time to do them all today, but there's other things around health of adoptees. There's a whole section about prenatal and antenatal care, and how trauma informed that adult adoptees have found that to be. And there are lots of other things about adopted families and adopted children as well. So I'd really encourage you to perhaps go and take a look and see the stories that I've not been able to tell you today. We are coming up to 10 to 2. I'm just going to show you that the barometer report, I'm giving you here a summary of recommendations. So it's really top line, but the report itself has got more detail in the recommendations, and they are more tailored to the specific situation in Scotland. But our recommendations are around support planning for adopted children and young people. They're around training for education and health professionals, so that adoptees get better understanding and support in education and health, and as I've said, with perhaps the knock-on effect that it might take some pressure off adoption services. For ring-fence funding for well-evidenced therapeutic support for adoptees of all ages. So we're looking at calling on governments across the UK to ensure there is enough funding for every adopted child everywhere in Scotland to be offered the same level of therapeutic input and support, so there isn't this concern about the range of what's on offer, but also for adoptees as adults also to be able to access well evidenced therapeutic support, ideally through the NHS, to be honest. Ideally, the NHS services for mental health would be adoptee competent. And again, for adult adoptees, reliable support to access personal records, connect with birth families and get the health treatment they need, even if family medical history is unknown. Just very briefly, some of the things that are going on now with the Adoption Barometer. I'm obviously here today speaking to you, which is absolutely brilliant. Across the UK, copies of the report have been sent directly to members of the Scottish Parliament, the members of the Assembly in Wales and in Northern Ireland, and at Westminster as well. We're holding a number of events around the UK. There's a medical, in fact, I think it was last night or the night before, they held a panel event in Northern Ireland to discuss this issue about medical records, which I'm really hoping to hear about because it looked like it was going to be really interesting. In Wales, there will be a big adoption conversation event. I know in Scotland there are various events going on. In England, we're briefing everybody that I can possibly brief. We use the data for all kinds of government consultations to support academic research and all kinds of different things. So I want you to know that the data that is in the Adoption Barometer doesn't just stay with us, it goes everywhere. But I'm not going to give the last word. I said to you, didn't I, that some adopted young people had completed this survey, and in order to, we just really wanted everyone to have the opportunity to hear what it was that they had to say. And so my colleagues at Adoption UK Scotland have worked with some adopted young people to put together this little video. It's 3 minutes and it encapsulates a lot of what our adopted young people had to tell us. And so I'm going to finish, I'll play myself out with this video before I hand over to Denise to tidy things up for us. I'm hoping it'll play now. There we go.
As part of this year's Adoption Barometer survey, we asked young adopted people aged 16 to 25 for their thoughts about adoption. They've told us what's working and what's broken. This video shares what they said, what the stats reveal, and 5 things that need to change.
Support for anyone should be lifelong. It needs to be there whenever we need it.
I live in supported living, but I rely on my parents and the staff who support me. I'm scared that one day they won't be there to help me anymore.
Adoption agencies should provide support packages for adopted teenagers and young adults, with opportunities for young people to engage with each other for support.
Peer support is crucial for young people. Youth services such as the E-Project provide us with a community network that we can drop into whenever we want. We need spaces where we can be ourselves without having to mask or try to be someone we're not.
There should be programs available for those that are adopted about how to navigate life, including how to build relationships with birth family and how to grieve if there isn't a relationship there.
Conversations should be had with us well before 16. These should have been when we were 13 or 14, when we are choosing subjects at school and thinking about our future.
All adopted young people should automatically have a support plan so that everyone understands the impact of their trauma. We need specialist advocacy services. There are services that provide advocacy for care experienced young people, but many of us have been told that we're not care experienced enough to access them.
It took years for CAMS to tell us they had support for care experienced young people in my area, but because I am adopted, I wasn't entitled to it.
I felt patronised. They didn't really understand me. They told me I wasn't depressed and didn't offer me the support I really needed.
We need an adoption system that provides lifelong support. Share this video, write to your MP or MSP, and remember, you're not alone.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Becky, for talking us through, giving us that whistle-stop tour of the barometer today. So the full report is online, so we'd encourage everybody to go and have a look at that and maybe read some of the stories that Becky didn't have time to cover. Going forward, we'd be really keen to have some discussions on some of the points that have come up today in this, but really based on what you think you would like to talk about as well. So we'll send out to people just asking what they might like to come along and discuss. So thank you very much for your time today. I hope you've enjoyed this seminar.